I will present today a paper I wrote specifically for a dossier, Emerging Themes in Brazilian Political Theory and Science, which aims to discuss three things: climate emergency, democracy, and representation. The paper is Anti-Anthropocentric Democracy, Devices of Extra-Human Representation and Expression. Was published in 2022 and co-written with my dear professor, Ângela Marques from UFMG. Beyond contributing to enlarge Brazilian political science and environmental studies, this paper has the objective of examining the possibilities and conditions for an anti-anthropocentric democracy. By anti-anthropocentric democracy, I mean a political regime that strives to address unescapable anthropocentric biases in decision-making process that affects extra-human interests. This is a very simple normative ideal, but which is really challenging to achieve in practice. However, we can realize that anti-anthropocentric ideal by different tools, devices, and in various degrees. In this paper specifically, I examine and propose three political and communicative dispositives. First, engaging with other cosmologies on nature, like indigenous cosmologies. The code on nature is to highlight and to remember that what we consider as nature or culture, or even if those concepts exist at all, varies according to ontologies and cosmologies that we consider. Secondly, empowered democratic innovations and deliberative innovations. And lastly, mitigating ontological incommensurabilities through dissensual aesthetic experiences, but I will focus specifically on images. Well, why mitigate anthropocentrism? I bring here three reasons, but we could talk about many others. Firstly, the commodification of nature, because we believe the literature also argue that more ethical, ecological, and sustainable relationships with nature will depend on changes on how we define and extract resources. Secondly, our survival as a species and planet depends to challenging the human narcissism and exceptionalism and promoting practices and policies that recognize the interdependence of all beings that exist on Earth. And finally, acknowledging extra-human agency is a key to foster more creative policies and solutions to concrete problems of our daily lives. But how? That is the question. In this paper, I constructed an argumentation pathway to address some of those questions, and with a theoretical and empirical reflection that is conducted like this. We first question how extra-humans can be considered as bearers of an inalienable political interest that grants to them moral status. Considering that we can theoretically ground extra-human interests, we explore how deliberative democracy affords us other ways for expression, construction, and representation of those extra-human political interests beyond elections. Third, we draw from political anthropology and learn about the potence of cosmologies beyond the modern Western perspective and participatory lessons from indigenous empowerment, and decision-making. Lastly, we delve into philosophy of aesthetics, examining the role of dissensual images in reconfiguring dominant ways of feeling, understanding, and valuing lives. So we will start our presentation by considering on what grounds we can consider extra-humans as bearers of inalienable and politically relevant interests, and based on that, what kind of principles we can construct to mitigate our anthropocentrism in decision-making that affects those interests. Well, I will start. Since the 70s, academics, notable Christopher Stone, have been building theories, trying to ground and bring arguments for extra-human rights. Stone's pioneering work extends legal rights to nature and proposes a guardianship model wherein certain humans act as guardians of rights, being nature's representatives. Along the time, the first law, which explicitly considered nature's welfare, was enacted in Tamaqua, Pennsylvania in 2005. Famously, we also know about the Equator Constitution that included nature rights in 2008, recognizing nature as a right-bearing entity just close to a personhood. We also need to highlight that due to indigenous activism and many global debates, the rivers like the Wanganui in New Zealand and India, Ganges and Yamuna also turned out to hold legal status similar of person. So this is not a new debate. Actually, we already have extra-human entities that is considered by law and by many people as bearers of rights. However, despite the great struggles and achievements to advance and enforce these progressive legislatures, the debate about representation, consideration, and political communication with extra-human entities have received limited attention and scrutiny. Put aside some works like the recent Romero and Drizek debate about biosemiotics, which is really inspiring for me. So I question, for instance, while the Maori indigenous people are one of the guardians of the Wanganui River in New Zealand, we can see that in other places, this is not like that. For instance, in India, the guardianships of Ganges and Yamuna rivers is the state. So the discussion about the representation of those extra-human entities needs to be addressed with more attention. So I question, beyond the law, how can we be more sensitive to extra-human needs and interests to establish more efficient and responsive democratic norms, rights, and obligations? How do we conceive democratic methods for constructing and presenting extra-human political demands in democratic decision-making? And lastly, how to evaluate the quality of extra-human representation? So, to start trying to answer into those difficult questions, we delve into the work of the Chilean anthropologist Alfonso Donoso to see how can we understand some of his compelling proposals. In his work, we can try to reflect about in what grounds biological extra-humans have a representable, inalienable political interest that is persist in their own existence. Also, we can reflect how democratic representation of extra-humans should consider their inalienable political interest to mitigate bias and inhuman decision-making that affects extra-humans. And finally, Donoso also tries to bring to us some principles that can be established to guide the process of representation and consideration of extra-human entities. So I will not go deep in Donoso's work, which is really inspiring for me, but I will try to bring some concepts that he draws based on men of theoretical work, and what is important to highlight is that what he conceives as interest, it's not something like a desire or a claim or a project of profits. No. Interest for him and for many activists in this area, it's a set of conditions which, when violated, produces harm to someone. It's a negative concept and a really vitalist concept. Interest as a set of conditions that, when violated, produces harm to someone. Considered a so-called biocentric paradigm, if we consider the fact that living creatures, human or extra-humans, strive to persevere in their existence, and considering that the violation of these existential conditions causes harm to them, we can speak that everything that lives has an intrinsic interest in a biological point of view to continue living. However, we need to consider also that the means that living creatures apply for the realization of their intrinsic interest to strive in living, in most cases, affects and are affected by others, because we don't have a perfect symbiosis between species and life beings. We need to consider that this intrinsic interest to persist in one existence is a political interest, because it affects and is being affected by others' struggle to continue living. That's why Donoso proposes that if we consider interest, this political quality of extra-human interests, we can also consider extra-humans as moral beings who have a moral status, who, according to classical representative democracy theory, can be represented in decision-making. However, it is really important to consider, like I did in the paper, that we need to be really careful about relying on biological paradigms to define the political status of a being. Like we can discuss this later, but this was done famously by the political animal by Aristotle, who excluded from the polis men, the animals, and also other humans, like women, slaves, etc. Well, in the work of Donoso, if we accept that human entities have an intrinsic and politically relevant interest in striving with their existence, we must acknowledge our human failure to sufficiently consider those interests in pursuing our own as a species. But would it be possible for us to construct principles that could mitigate or disregard, and even that could mitigate our disregard and even violation of extra-human interests? Most of that literature sends a political realist message to us. Our judgments and decision-making will be inevitable anthropocentric. This is not to accept that as we are unescapable anthropocentric, we don't need to run away for that conditions, but we need to seek to mitigate that anthropocentric bias, assuming the responsibility of others' interests and lives. That's how Donoso builds 4 principles that can help us to mitigate our anthropocentric bias in the decision-making that affect extra-human interests. We can see in the board that while the first 3 principles that Donoso constructed are concerned with qualifying when the violation of the extra-human interest is or is not a crime, is or is not an evil, the last one is concerned with a need for reparation for the damages that we eventually will do on extra-humans. We can discuss more of those principles later below, but I'm just bringing those principles to show that there is occurring theorizations and reflections about how can we address our anthropocentric bias. And by doing that, we need to consider that with some degree of control, restriction, and even renunciation of our human interests, we can achieve, at least in degrees, some kind of anthropocentric compromises and policies. By only recognizing that we need to control, we need to be conscious, we need to be reflective, and also we need to repair the damages that we are creating. However, one question that Donoso does not work on is, once we face this urgent goal of mitigating human anthropocentrism in decision-making, who will represent and defend those extra-human interests? How can these interests or limits on human action and also demands for reparations can be democratically constructed, considered, and affect the decision-making? This question brings us to the second part of the paper, where we will reflect about political and communicational devices for anti-anthropocentric representation and political expression of that what I'm calling extra-human interests. The first device that I want to explore is the proposal of an inalienable indigenous participation in representation and decision-making about extra-humans. As we mentioned it before, there are places like New Zealand that are explicitly recognizing indigenous people like the Maori as one of the rightful guardians of rivers of nature, while almost all the other countries don't. But how and why we can defend this kind of device? I work with 3 arguments and 3 evidence. The first one is a demographic argument that points out that the most of the planet's biodiversity is now directly or indirectly conserved by indigenous people. The second evidence or argument is a cultural one, is that indigenous resistance to centuries or millennia of colonialism and genocide shows that their knowledge and practice are a powerful way to make endure and making last or making endure, including human lives and nature, like I said about the demographic evidence. And in other words, the third evidence that I bring here is that a cosmological evidence that states that different ontologies have a different ways to conceive what exists, what counts as lives, as moral beings, and if we can enhance, we can foster our ways of considering extra humans by multiplying the cosmologies, the ontologies that we use, that we reference to make our laws, to make our policies, to make our practices. In our Western materialist ontologies, because we conceive nature mostly as a resource, it is very easy and even legitimated to destroy the environment to satisfy human desires and needs. We need to think about another modes, ontological and cosmological ways to conceive what we call nature. Let's take a quick look in some examples from Amerindian anthropology in South America. In the work of Boris Fausto, we can see that the ethnographic words shows that nature is domestic for many Amerindian indigenous people, because it's not something that it's right there, that it's outside there, waiting humans to take control, to extract resources. No, nature has some owners. For the Ashuar indigenous group, Ashuar, for example, the forest is the plantation of Shakain. Wild animals are relatives of the hunting mothers that are under the guardianship of Nunkai, the spiritual woman who is at the origin of the cultivators of what we call nature. The non-human world in those Amerindian cosmologies is neither everyone's nor anyone's land. As the Kwikuro and other indigenous people say, it's not Tatulu Engu and everybody's thing, which is equivalent to say that there is nobody to take care of. That's not something like that. It's because there are caring owners of extra-human entities that the Kwikuru, when they go on collecting fishing trip, they use a long incantation in which they enunciate the name of all the owners of the water and request permission for them to do the predatory fishing, and they also ask to not hide the fishes from them. What I'm trying to highlight here is that they need to ask permission to other beings that will putting them in political relations that constrain them to only think on nature as a resource depositee who is there waiting for us to extract. No, there is respect. There is another political relationships that they take in consideration, and that's why they tend to be more careful with nature in comparison to our Western materialist cosmology. So I will accelerate now because my time is ending. The second device is the empowered deliberation, to try to bring those cosmologies inside our decision-making, to put those cosmologies in communication with our own modes of conceiving the world, of constructing policies, of constructing laws. We all know that it's really serious empirical evidence that shows that deliberative institutions, they can foster more ethical, reasoned, and democratic decision-making in our daily lives. And we can see that many deliberative experiments, institutions in Canada are using deliberative democracies experiments to bring Indigenous and white people to the table and try to make a more democratic decision-making about nature. However, we are seeing that they have many difficulties and constraints and disadvantages for those Indigenous perspectives and political participations. Like with Valadez attested that it is difficult for the white people to consider other cosmologies, other ontologies when they are discussing about nature. But partial success occurs when they shift from discussing premises to identifying common interests and defining collective action goals. A more pragmatical democratic innovations can have a partial success to achieve these objectives. I'm also in the paper saw in the experiments the Ottaway River Reborn, they have achieved many success bringing Indigenous people and white people to deliberate about a river dam that would be closed, decommissioned in Canada. And I saw that beyond shifting the focus of those deliberative events to more pragmatic questions and searching for common interests, the use of images and videos of the Ottaway River makes those who are included in the deliberation to change the way they conceive it, the river, the way they are affected by the river as a being, as an extra human being. I bring this quotation, who one of the participants said in the documentary of this democratic innovation. If the river could speak, it would tell us, let me flow, let me splash, let me do what I must do. This is my blood. It's flowing through my veins. I'm part of a role environment, and I have a role to play in that. There are other mechanisms and dispositives to empower democratic deliberation. We can discuss that with more attention later, like oversampling disadvantaged or marginalized groups, promoting deliberations beyond rational exchange of discourses, and embracing respectful dissent between participants. That's why in the last part of the paper, I also propose beyond articulating with other cosmologies beyond Western materialist cosmologies and constructing empowered deliberative and other democratic innovations to decision-making about extra-humans. We can also use dissensual images and sensory experiences to address, to try to tackle our habitual and hegemonic ways of conceiving the world. Our, how Rancière would say, our partages of sensible, and try to, in this way, alter and challenge the habitual ways of feeling, classifying, and valuing extra humans. In the paper, I reflect on 3 dimensions of these dissensual images: embodiment, desensualizing, and vulnerabilizing the way we conceive, we represent, and we show extra humans in our medias, in our videos, and bring those dissensual images to the decision making. I bring some examples from those scenes, those vulnerable scenes, those precarious scenes of that were pictured in Brazilian Pantanal after a huge fires destructed the nature. And then we can see how extra-human beings have really interested to be alive. They suffer, they are vulnerable, they depend that humans reconsider our anthropocentric narcissism that is affecting their existence. Obviously, after the paper, I reflect that we don't need only to focus on those vulnerable and precarious images to affect the way we conceive on extra-humans. We can also construct, this is a concept that I draw from Peter Popelbach, one philosophy, images of biopuissance or biopotency that shows how extra-humans, they can relate with themselves, with joy, with happiness. They are keen to be alive. They are striving to be alive. They have interest to be alive. And that's why we need to respect the way they want to live, the way they relate with each other. So I end here. And for conclusions, ways forward, we need to reflect in my paper. I didn't address the limits of the biocentered paradigm that we use it to fundament those extra-human interests. There are some current really good work, like our dear colleague Hans Azenbaum is bringing about that uses another paradigm, a neo-materialistic paradigm, to think about extra-humans, even those who are not sentient, even those who are not biological entities. There are the challenges of deliberative innovations, the connections with decision-making and public sphere that we still need to address, and how those dissensual images can be produced. I think that one way is relying once again on alliance with indigenous perspectives to bring images of what we call nature that can challenge the way we conceive, we feel, and we value nature. That's it. Sorry for that. Thank you very much.